It looks like we're live. People will join as we kick off, but might as well begin. Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm the host of this very podcast, Global Dispatches, coming to you from world headquarters in Denver, Colorado. Andrew, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Andrew Green. I'm a freelance journalist who covers primarily global health issues, and I'm coming to you live from rural southern Zambia, where it is pouring down rain right now in the midst of the rainy season.
But the connection is crystal clear. So thank you to everyone at Substack for making this happen. I call this show Global Dispatches, and I often interview people from around the world. But I know how logistically and temperamental the internet and connection can be in rural sub-Saharan Africa in the midst of rainy season. So thank you.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So I we are speaking at just nearly the 1 year anniversary of the executive order that decimated longstanding American historical commitments and funding to fight HIV and AIDS around the world. That executive order was issued on January 24th, 2025. We're speaking Monday, January 26th, 2026. And what a year it has been. Before we talk about the impact of these cuts, Andrew, I know I'm reaching, as I said, in southern Zambia. You are in the midst of a really remarkable reporting project. Could you just briefly describe this project for the audience?
Yeah, definitely. I had the good fortune and a very unfortunate circumstance to have some funding to go to the communities that were most affected by the decision that Donald Trump made to start cutting HIV spending. So for the past year, I've had the chance to travel primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, which was the region that was benefiting most from U.S. support, to actually embed myself in some of the communities that had benefited from these HIV programs that the U.S. had been funding, and to really collect personal narratives and about what that impact has looked like in the course of people's lives. So for the past year, I've been to Uganda twice, Botswana, to Malawi, I'm now in Zambia, and also to Thailand briefly, which has also benefited from U.S. support. And in the process, collected at this point hundreds of interviews with people just about what's happened to them in that time, and to try to chart the impact that these funding cuts have had.
And we'll discuss all of that in a bit. But to kick off, I'd love to have you, kind of like situate listeners and viewers a little bit. Like, what did American contributions to the global fight against HIV and AIDS look like prior to a year ago in January?
So the United States was really the backbone of the global HIV response, and has been for the better part of more than 2 decades. And to kind of put that in perspective, the global HIV response is probably the most successful global health response, maybe in human history. And so you're looking at an investment over more than 20 years of $100 billion plus, that's resulted in 25 million lives saved. And I think that's probably a very conservative estimate. And also, millions and millions of people who have not become infected because of programs to prevent them from getting HIV. And what that's really looked like is U.S. agencies coming into countries around the world, but again, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, that were most affected by HIV, and over decades building up the systems to respond to the virus. And so that, in the early days, I was just putting the basics in place, testing treatment when it became available, and getting people who were desperately ill on treatment and saving their lives. But what we've seen over especially the past decade, is a massive expansion of these programs. And so now we're at a point where, as soon as anyone is diagnosed with HIV, they're immediately started on treatment. We're seeing this massive expansion of prevention programs, really new, groundbreaking technologies. We're talking about injectable drugs that you can be given once every 6 months, and are 100% effective in preventing HIV infection. And this again is all on the back of significant U.S. investments, but also partnerships then with countries and with communities to stand these programs up and to really reach the last mile. And I think, the important context is that we were working toward this global goal of ending AIDS as an epidemic by 2030. And what that meant was that people should not be getting infected anymore and people should not be dying from AIDS by 2030. And we weren't quite on track to reaching that goal, but we were very close. And a lot of countries were on track.
Mhm. Like
And
Zambia, where you are, for example, was on track, or if not, had already almost met that goal a year ago,
exactly.
right?
Exactly. And so, a place like Zambia, they're really gearing up toward potentially ending the epidemic in the next 4 or 5 years. And that would be a massive shift, both in terms of the kind of funding that would be required, but then also in lives saved and people's lives who are affected by this. And so, um, what's happened, I think, in the past year is that we've seen a complete reversal, and I think we'll probably talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it is, like, worth emphasizing, if you look at all the data collected over the last 20 years, like, the curves were all going the right way. In some places, they weren't moving as quickly as they should have been towards the right direction, but in other places, like Zambia, they certainly were. And that's why this sudden and swift, in my view, capricious, reversal of PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was began, in the Bush administration over 20 years ago, was such like a sting to the global health community in general, and more importantly to the people impacted living with HIV and AIDS, or who had not yet been infected by HIV and AIDS, people in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. So, you know, you're in Zambia right now. Like, what are you seeing? What are you hearing about the impact that these cuts have had 1 year on?
Yeah. So I think, what's been interesting in having the privilege of kind of being in these communities over the past year and charting the impact is that the initial chaos of like Trump just cutting all US financing temporarily as of January 24th last year, that's kind of subsided. So people have started to adapt to this new reality, start to rebuild systems that had kind of collapsed in the wake of that, the funding pause, and then the subsequent cuts that Elon Musk and Doge enacted on the HIV response. But what we're not so, and at the same time, we're also seeing the U.S. kind of committed to continuing HIV testing and treatment and very specific prevention programs to prevent mothers from transmitting HIV to their children. But most other prevention programs have been cut.
So
And
there's
I
still
think what
some programs that were left, because there was this kind of almost a domestic backlash against it here. I mean, this was a program historically supported by Republicans as well. It was like
Mhm.
one of the few remaining areas of bipartisan, consensus that Trump blew up with that executive order.
Exactly, and I mean, you saw some effort. So you saw the administration make some effort to cut funding from that had already been allocated to PEPFAR over the summer, and you saw Congress push back on that and rescue those funds, which then the U.S. administration still has not spent in a lot of cases. So you're seeing again massive shortfalls. But you did see the Trump administration after the initial pause, which created, again, like this huge amounts of chaos in communities, people just hearing that like all of a sudden they're losing access to life-saving HIV treatment. You did see those programs get kind of partially restored, but these kind of additional programs that are critical to the success of the HIV response over the past 2 decades just being eliminated wholesale. And that's taken a particular toll on community-based interventions. And so what that means is that these are people who have HIV, who have experience of living with people who have HIV, who are very knowledgeable and are very empathetic and can approach communities, and integrate quite easily and have conversations that are very delicate and very difficult. And they can talk to people about why they might not be taking their treatment. They can talk to people about getting tested. I mean, these were the programs that were ensuring that we were reaching, again, the last mile, that we were getting to the point where we could end AIDS as an
Mhm.
epidemic. And those have been just completely cut wholesale. I mean, you just
Yeah.
don't see that anymore. So
Yeah, I
in a
mean,
place like
just to
Zambia,
emphasize that, I've done my own kind of reporting trips on this issue over the years, and, you're talking about, like, community-based interventions, you're really talking about, like, hyper local things where you have, like, men who have sex with men kind of meeting with other people, or, giving them advice on how to access treatment, or, like, injecting drug users who are, like, a high
right.
risk cohort, or sex workers who might be a high risk cohorts, having like kind of support groups basically that like
Exactly.
help them find treatment. It's like very local, honestly, very low cost, but very high impact interventions like that have made like a huge difference in particularly in like the last mile, as you said, as we've kind of turned the corner
Mhm.
against, huge HIV rates among like the general population. It's these like targeted populations that need to be their HIV numbers reduced.
Exactly. I mean, that's again, if your commitment is actually to ending the epidemic, if it's actually to reaching everyone, then you have to have these programs because that's the only way you're going to reach all the people who need services. And I've been in rural Uganda talking to community health workers whose obligation was to travel, 2 to 3 miles on the back of a motorbike, get off, and then cross several streams to get HIV medicines to people who relied on them. And that was just the commitment that the country, with the support of the United States, had made to this community of people to say, we're going to continue to get you treatment, even though it requires all the, getting over all of these hurdles. Those people do not have the resources to, that funding has been cut, that service is gone. And the people who are relying on it do not have the resources to get to the clinic to get their HIV medicine. So what you're going to see is that they're just going to fall off and that they're going, the rates of HIV are going to increase um, in their body, that they're going to have rebound and potentially develop resistance to drugs. And this is happening just across communities that I've been visiting, reporting from for the past year.
Well, one thing that's remarkable, I think, about your reporting project is that you're just documenting, you're creating almost oral histories of people who are living through this disruptive moment in their own personal lives. Can you share some of those stories?
Yeah, it's been, I've been really honored that people have been so willing to talk about their experience. I think there's a real sense that they feel like they're being forgotten, and so they want an opportunity to tell the world what's happening to them. But it's situations like I met a man named McDonald Peary in central Malawi. He is a gay man who has been very active in the community of volunteering, making sure that other men who have sex with men in his community are getting access to prevention medicine or coming in for their treatment. He was working from a local HIV clinic that specifically focused on services for men who have sex with men and transgender women. And as part of the broader cuts, there seems to be very specific ideological cuts that have been enacted by the Trump administration against services for these key populations, sex workers, men who have sex with men, people who inject drugs. And so his clinic lost all of its support. This coincided with him having a bicycle accident. And so he was unable to make the trip to the clinic to get medicines at the same time that the clinic was no longer able to deliver the drugs to him. And so he lost his access to preventive care. He now is infected with HIV. This is devastating. It's terrible. It means that he's going to have to be on lifelong treatment. It really took a psychic toll on him. It also doesn't make any sense because it's way more expensive to keep him on treatment now for the rest of his life than would have been just to prop up this preventive care program. So it doesn't make sense that the US would be, focusing on treatment and the financing of treatment when and neglecting these prevention services. But you hear these kinds of, awful stories just across the continent, people who were enrolled in programs to test new prevention technologies who then lost access to those technologies because the research was cut. Um, I think the most devastating story that I've heard was from a mother whose daughter was benefiting from services that helped her stick to her HIV treatment. She suffered from a history, she had a history of depression, had difficulty staying on her treatment. That program was cut. She stopped taking her treatment and she died in March of last year. And these kinds these stories are these things are happening in communities. They're often at this point far flung, remote, rural, but it's going to metastasize. It's going to get worse, and you're going to
Mhm.
see again an increase in death and suffering as a result of this virus that we were so close to defeating.
So, you're telling these like many individual stories through your reporting, but I have to imagine from like an epidemiological, point of view that like the many individual stories that you're telling of people whose HIV has rebounded after having been suppressed for so long, that you multiply that, as you said, by my many factors, and you will see a resurgence of HIV and AIDS in places where it had largely been suppressed. And I'm curious to learn what you're hearing from African governments and ministries of health and, the broader, health communities in the places that you're visiting about how they might be guarding themselves against this potential outcome.
So I think there was this immediate emphasis, and governments responded very quickly in the wake of the funding, the pause, and then the cuts to services to shore up basic treatment. So there was a commitment to saying, lives are not going to be lost to the extent that we can save them because people can't get access to drugs. What then has happened is that you started to see all the different ways in which the United States was supporting even these basic treatment services. So this is like keeping records, the data systems up to date in facilities. This is doing the shoring up the delivery systems for HIV medicines. And so as those cracks have kind of emerged, countries have had to be very quick to respond to figure out how they're going to then institute their own data systems, how they're going to, take over warehousing of drugs. And so there's been this rush to protect treatment. And I think that's crucial. And obviously that's really, that's particularly important because it maintains trust in the government and their ability to maintain, to keep these services running. And so people don't lose faith that all of a sudden they're going to just wholesale start dying again as they did 20, 30 years ago. Um, but governments have limited resources and they were really relying on the United States. And what I hear over and over again is if they've had any kind of warning, if there had been any kind of effort to, build this out, this kind of reduction in funding out over years, then they could have prepared themselves. But they didn't have that chance. And so they just have had to abandon things like prevention programs at the moment or these kind of community support programs with the idea that like they would love to be supporting them again, to be funding them again in the future. But at the moment, it's just not possible. Um, and so we're at this kind of crucial moment where countries are really deciding what their priorities are going to be moving forward. The U.S. is coming back online with some commitment to finance some of these services. So we're at the kind of tentative moment to see like what the future of the HIV response is going to look like, and crucially, who's going to be left behind in that response.
Mhm. Now, my understanding is that the way in which the United States might come back in some circumstances in terms of supporting HIV, AIDS response, but also like general development support, is through bilateral negotiations with governments. And this is probably happening, I would imagine, with Zambia right now. But that part of these agreements might include, access to the country's natural resources or
Mm.
some sort of quid pro quo that would result in the release of some American funding for development priorities, including and global health priorities, including HIV and AIDS. Like I know Zambia is like a major copper
Yeah.
exporter around the world, like a lot of copper mines there. Like, are you seeing or hearing any evidence of the Trump administration trying to like seek access to copper exports in exchange for releasing, development funds?
Yes, exactly. And actually Zambia is kind of the poster child of that quid pro quo that you're describing.
Huh.
So the US
For the record, I
has
didn't know that
reached
going into this question. I was just kind of guessing based on everything I knew about Zambia and
Yeah.
what's going on in the administration, but please explain.
Yeah, yeah. So they've reached the US has reached agreements with 15 countries so far, all of them in sub-Saharan Africa. And Zambia was supposed to be one of those. It was supposed to be the 16th. It was supposed to happen. The deal was supposed to be signed last December. And then all of a sudden you got this announcement from the United States saying the deal has been postponed because they're not getting access to mining rights that they are demanding in return for financing. They not just the HIV response, but like health response in general in Zambia. And so what I'm hearing, now having done reporting here for about 3 weeks, is that the deal is going to be signed probably in a matter of days. But it's taken them more than a month to get to the point where they've decided on what concessions they're willing to make on the Zambian side to satisfy the United States, but also what they're not willing to give. And the likelihood is we're not going to see the details of those agreements anytime soon. They've kept them very secret.
So, I mean, what do you suspect this includes? And first of all, it's kind of fascinating that this agreement would remain secret between the two governments, which is interesting. That's like kind of how China operates in these countries. They keep their agreements like secret and away from the public. So it's kind of interesting to see the Trump administration if indeed the details of this kind of quid pro quo are not released, it's interesting to see the Trump administration kind of mimic the Chinese approach to development assistance. But then maybe that's like a conversation for another day. Um, like, what might this deal include, to your knowledge?
So one thing that we're certain of based on the agree, so Kenya actually, the government of Kenya actually released their deal that they signed back in late November, early December, and is the only government so far to do that. And so, what the U.S. definitely wants is access to health data from countries. And you actually saw activists in Kenya go to the court and get the agreement paused, at least temporarily, because of violations of data sovereignty laws in Kenya. There activists in Zambia that I've been speaking to are anticipating that there's going to be a similar clause in their deal, and they're also thinking about what kind of strategic litigation they might bring against that. And then we've also heard things like in Nigeria there was a focus that the United States made asking the Nigerian government to protect the Christian minority populations there in return for domestic financing. Here, at Zambia, it's very much focused on mining concessions. So um, I don't know if these details are ever going to come out in terms of what the United States is asking for, but we are at least getting some kind of indications of what's in them, what some of the expectations are. I think
I want, yeah. Oh, sorry, no, please go ahead.
the other thing that's worth pointing out is these are only 5-year deals, but a lot of what the United States is asking for, especially in terms of like the data, is for 20 plus years, and so they're locking governments into these commitments. But with they're offering not. It's not that they're not offering anything, but what they're offering is much less than what the United States was offering before, and it's also going to drop very precipitously over the next 5 years.
What's the interest? Like, why does the U.S. want health information on Zambians?
They're very interested. They seem to be based on the details that have been released so far. They're very interested in preventing future outbreaks, and so what they want is governments. They want to invest, and they want domestic governments to invest um, in frontline health workers who are going to be monitoring for potential outbreaks, and then also building up laboratory capacity and surveillance capacity within countries. And then they want, their obligation. They're writing obligations into these agreements that they need data within 24 hours of any potential outbreak. So this is all kind of falling under the rubric of the America First Global Health Agreement. And the idea is, they want to protect Americans using, on the back of data that African governments might be collecting.
I'm curious to learn, like, in general, what the response has been from both government officials and, regular people that you are speaking with in Zambia in terms of, tying American aid to access to, say, mining concessions. Now, like PEPFAR, American Foreign Aid, it was never like purely giving of
Right.
alms, right? There was always some broader strategic intent around providing foreign aid and providing support for countries to battle HIV and AIDS, but it was never as directly tied to a
Mhm.
quid pro quo as this seems to be. So, what's generally been the reaction?
Yeah, the explicit nature is like on one hand, it's kind of breathtaking. I think also on the other hand, a lot of people are just like, well, at least it's out in the open now. Um, I think on the government side, there is a real sense that they don't have a lot of choice. I mean, they saw how dependent their systems were on US funding. And the past year has really, you know, it's been a lesson in like, governments need to take more responsibility for funding their own domestic HIV and broader health response. And I think that's been internalized, but it's going to take some time. And they need this financing from the United States to kind of bridge to get to a point where they can be less dependent. A lot of countries already had these kind of 5-year plans in place, and so they need to actualize that with the financing that the United States is going to offer. So that's why you've seen them sign these deals quite quickly. I mean, this happened in a matter of weeks.
Hmm.
On the ground, I mean, there's huge frustration, especially among civil society and activists, because they're locked out of these conversations almost completely. They're not being given any indication of what governments are signing themselves up to. In fact, even in Uganda, where I was doing some reporting, parliamentarians are being asked to make financing commitments to meet the obligations of the deal that Uganda signed with the United States without being told what that deal involves.
Hmm.
And this is just kind of consistently happening across the continent. And so there's a real pushback, but then also this sense of like, what leverage do they have at this point? This isn't, this isn't garnering a lot of political attention right now. The suffering that people are dealing with, the deaths that people are dealing with, are kind of in isolated, remote communities. So it's not getting a lot of it's not front page news, and so then activists are having a hard time kind of garnering the kind of support they need to press their governments to maybe perhaps not make these kind of concessions, to ask for more, to put more resources into the HIV response themselves.
Um, Before I let you go, is there another story that you wanted to share among those that you've collected throughout this reporting project?
I think that one of the stories that's really stuck with me and that's kind of most indicative is I met this woman named Mercy when I was in rural Malawi, and I'd gone to a clinic, and was just kind of uh, people were just allowing me to hang out, the health workers very kindly. And this woman came in. She was very nervous. She was quite upset. She had been on HIV medication. She was HIV positive and had been on treatment for years and years and years. And she had heard in the immediate aftermath of the funding cuts, that in the aftermath of the stop work order that paused all US financing, that HIV services had been cut off, that they were just finished. So she thought she had lost access to her life-saving treatment. So she traveled, she went from Malawi, she crossed over into Zambia to buy black market antiretroviral drugs to keep to keep herself safe. She started selling off everything that she owned. She sold her business. She made every effort she possibly could have to stay on HIV treatment. Um, this is all happening against the backdrop of there's no community health workers then to inform her that services still exist. There's no outreach happening. That component was completely dismantled by the US. And I think it's just a testament. But so finally, she kind of got word you can go to the clinic. They still have drugs, and she went. With like the last dollar she had, she left a will for her children behind because she thought she was going to die. It's just this really heartbreaking story, but also just testament to like how committed she was to staying on HIV medicine. And I think that's what's being lost, in the United States, that it's very kind of patronizing. Like, we gave you all this funding, you haven't done anything with it. You haven't, internalized these programs yourselves. And it's like people really did. People have made huge efforts. The communities have really rallied around this funding, have turned it into programs. People have been, committed themselves to HIV research, put their bodies on the line. So this was a partnership that's been dismantled. Somebody like Mercy did everything she possibly could to take advantage of the beneficence of the United States government, and just to kind of cut people off and just say, this partnership is over. Without any kind of warning. It's just so cruel to see this like repeated over and over and over again in these communities.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for your reporting. Why don't you plug your Substack so people know how to follow you?
Yeah, the Substack is called the Forsaken, and I have a kind of month or weekly reports on what I'm hearing on the ground in the countries where I'm reporting from.
Yeah, I've subscribed. Thank you so much. I encourage
Thank you.
folks to subscribe. Please do also subscribe to Global Dispatches, get a paid subscription too, which helps me bring voices like Andrew's from southern Zambia, and around the world to you to cover these kinds of stories that, people don't really see in more mainstream outlets. So I depend on your support. So thank you so much. Andrew, good luck and let's check in again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you.